Hello, and welcome to today's video. Today's lecture is about James Smithson, and all the ways something incredible almost didn't happen. Smithsonian Institution. James Smithson, pictured here, was an English scientist with a royal pedigree and a tremendous fortune, but no children. He was well known in British scientific circles for his study of minerals, but few in America had ever even heard his name. He died in 1829 in Italy and was buried in Genoa, an important port city. Smithson is still a bit of an enigma, but we do know he owned a fortune of roughly $500,000 and intended to bequeath his estate, as was custom, to his children, if he had any. So he puts in his will that he wants his money to go to his nephew, the closest he had as an heir, with one exception. If his nephew died without heirs, which he did in 1835, the money would go to America. This represents the first hurdle to the establishment of the American National Museum. If Smithson's nephew had had children, it's virtually certain we'd never have heard of the man and his money. But he didn't, and the government was notified. In full, Smithson said, "I bequeath the whole of my property to the United States of America, to found at Washington, under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men." That's pretty much it. Next, the American government had to decide whether or not to take the money. Does America need some foreigners' money? Was it even constitutional? This represented the second hurdle to overcome. The government could have rejected the donation altogether, but they didn't, and sent a delegation to collect the money in England. American diplomat Richard Rush was sent by President Andrew Jackson to collect the gift. Then they had to bring it back. What if it sank at sea? Here, again, is another moment when all could have been lost, but wasn't. After an arduous journey across the sea, Rush returned in August 1838 with literally over 100 bags of gold coins. It represented 1.5% of the federal budget at the time. That ratio today would be about $75 billion. Then they had to decide what to do with the money. An institution for the creation and diffusion of knowledge could be a lot of different things. They could have just as reasonably created a school out of it, or a university, so Congress debated. Trivia question. Do you know who is the only president to be a member of the House of Representatives after his presidential administration? It was John Quincy Adams. Adams, as former president and highly regarded sitting member of Congress, convinced his colleagues to put the funds toward science and learning, and ultimately what it has become today. Finally, it was President James K. Polk in 1846 who signed the legislation that established the Smithsonian Institution as a United States trust instrumentality with its own Board of Regents and a secretary to oversee it. In 1849, construction began on a headquarters for the institution, today known as the Castle, built in the Gothic and Romanesque revival styles by James Renwick Jr., who also designed St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. Notice its fanciful detailing, including 9 distinct towers, no 2 of which are the same. As the United States government sent out expeditions and collected scientific specimens from across the country and around the world, they built their next building, dating to 1881, today known as the Arts and Industries Building. This building is designed in the Victorian Renaissance Revival style, which, it should be noted, this narrator finds particularly distasteful. Alas. Its first major function was new President James Garfield's inaugural ball. Next came what is now known as the National Museum of Natural History, the most visited natural history museum in the world, and the largest Smithsonian by collection size, over 100 million items in its collection. Its great rotunda features a full-size African bull elephant. In later years, they would add more buildings, including what is now the National Museum of American History. Here you can see, among endless other items, Abraham Lincoln's top hat, Dorothy's ruby slippers, Seinfeld's puffy shirt, the First Lady's gowns, Archie Bunker's chair, Julia Child's kitchen, Muhammad Ali's boxing gloves, the Fonz's jacket, and Swedish Chef, as well as perhaps the crown jewel of the whole Smithsonian collection of over 150 million items, is the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag at Fort McHenry at Baltimore Harbor that moved a certain lawyer named Francis Scott Key to write what would become America's national anthem. Next came the Air and Space Museum in 1976 to coincide with America's bicentennial celebrations, the premier museum of its kind in the world. Here you can see the Wright Flyer, and this is the original, the world's first airplane, period. The Air and Space Museum is also the most visited museum in America and top 5 in the world. The newest addition is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, open to the public since late 2016. Its exterior is designed to glow in sunlight and features motifs inspired by iron grills found in African American communities in the American South, including New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina. Also to be seen on the grounds of the complex are, at the bottom of this image, the Freer and Sackler Galleries, constituting the National Museums of Asian Art, and the National Museum of African Art. The Arts and Industries building is on the right. Next to the Arts and Industries building is the National Museum of Contemporary Art, known as the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. The second newest Smithsonian is the National Museum of the American Indian, which opened in 2004. Its entrance faces eastward toward the rising sun, and its curving walls evoke images of the windswept cliffs of the American West. It was designed by an Aboriginal Canadian architect. In all, there are 19 Smithsonian museums in Washington, D.C., Virginia, and New York, only the most famous of which are on the National Mall. In all, the National Mall alone, we have today the National Museum of the American Indian, National Air and Space Museum, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, the Arts and Industries Building, the Castle, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of Natural History, and 2 world-class museums we'll get into in a separate video, the East and West buildings of the National Gallery of Art, independent from the Smithsonian. In all, about a half dozen of the world's greatest and most visited museums are on this 1-mile-long stretch of greenery from the Capitol to the Washington Monument. Stay tuned for more videos from Grand Atlas Tours. You can find us on Facebook, as well as grandatlastours.com.